Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chirine Sunderland, and I'll be moderating the talk today. I'm delighted to continue this afternoon with you all, with a panel that touches on a very current topic that makes a lot of buzzwords and some of the biggest challenges in today's urban landscape, and that is smart cities. So over the past decade, smart city has become a catchphrase used by policymakers, tech companies, and urban designers alike. From 5G infrastructure and AI-driven traffic lights to facial recognition and green energy grids, the concept is often sold as a vision of seamless, tech-empowered living. According to the European Commission, a smart city is a smart city is a place where traditional networks and services are made more efficient with the use of digital solutions for the benefit of its inhabitants and business. But what does it actually mean to build a smart city? And more importantly, smart for whom? Today, we'll take a look at the human side of smart city innovation and the global strategies shaping its rise, especially in Asia, Africa, and Europe, and better understand why it matters. Behind every piece of urban tech, there are real decisions about data, rights, infrastructure, and influence. And increasingly, the way cities evolve says as much about geopolitics as it does about city planning. This panel will explore that intersection between innovation, inclusion, and global power. We'll ask who benefits from smart cities, how are countries like China exploring their urban models abroad, and are we headed for collaboration or competition? I'm honored to be joined by 3 alumni today who each bring a unique perspective to the conversation. First of all, we have Ms. Hanbit Lee, who's a systems researcher working at the intersection of urban energy and public policy. We also have, on my right, Jean-Baptiste Sebgo, an advisor on international risks with deep experience in Asia-Africa relations. And last but not least, we have Francis Müller, a legal expert exploring how tech innovation impacts international trade and regulation. So, without further ado, let's begin the panel with our first question that I would like to ask all of our panelists today. How are smart cities being shaped by global powers, and what challenges and opportunities do different models create? I'm not sure who would like maybe to intervene first. Francis or Hanbit?
I think because I'm coming at this from a legal perspective, so I think I'm mostly going to focus on the aspect of privacy and how smart cities affect privacy and also data protection. I think there's, of course, a need to collect data in these smart cities, which constitutes a challenge to data protection laws and privacy. And especially because in contrast to other services offered by private companies, in a city you cannot really consent to the data being processed, because basically you're just living there, so you are dependent on the city services. So this creates kind of a unique problem in terms of data protection, which I think then leads to different consequences depending on data protection laws in various places. So just very briefly, if you think, for example, about China, in China there is a data protection regime, but the Chinese data protection regime only protects private individuals from abuses, data processing abuses from companies, but not from the government. So there's not a big problem in terms of this smart cities development, because basically the government is the driving force. And smart city technology is usually implemented by state-owned enterprises, and this also then shapes how Chinese smart cities evolves, with basically because the government is the main decision maker, basically government priorities being implemented by smart city solution, very much focusing on safety goals, not just surveillance, but also like traffic safety, etc. These kind of being the priorities. Then if you think it about in Europe, there is, like, because there is no way to consent to this data processing, it's also in the end the government which is the main driving force behind these smart cities solutions. However, of course, because democratic institutions have a much more complex goals, they try to balance a lot of government goals, which makes the implementation of these solutions much more difficult, but also, yeah, and also basically makes the rollout much slower. And then, I mean, if you think about America, there's only sectoral data protection laws anyway, so, and there you see a lot of fully private developments of these smart cities, but however, they usually face a lot of backlash, as for example, the Toronto project, etc. So that's more, I mean, I think like all of these together show that ultimately, nowadays, only the government is the only actor which can really implement these kind of smart city solution because of the existing framework, which in a liberal society is of course not a desirable state. So I guess what we will see, and maybe what I will also talk about afterwards, is that there's a need for kind of a new framework for data governance to allow to bring in private actors into these kind of implementations.
Okay, thank you for this great input. We look forward to listening more about what you have to say. Maybe as the second intervenant, I don't know if maybe Hanbit or Jean-Baptiste would like to maybe give their perspective or their experience in that context.
Yeah, I'm currently doing a research in urban energy transition. So to me, one of the issues that I feel most passionately about it, and arguably one of the greatest challenges that cities are facing currently, is climate change. And on this issue, climate change is, of course, a very divisive issue across global south and global north, but it can also be an opportunity for us to envision a different system for more equitable and more just system. And how I like to view climate change as an opportunity is that, if you can show the next slide. Yes, so this is a concept called donut economy, which was championed by academic Kate Raworth. And the idea basically is that on the outer shell, we have ecological planetary boundaries that includes ozone layer depletion, climate change, ocean acidifications. And these planetary boundaries kind of restrict what are the limits to from us living in a finite planet. And then in the inner side is the social systems, and what we want to maximize is providing basic good life for all, and what are the services that we have to provide. So we have to work within this donut framework of staying within the ecological overshoot, but also maximizing the basic services and rights that everyone should have. And I think this is a useful framework for cities to envision how we can use data and the newest advances in technology, not just to maximize profit for a certain group, but instead envision a society where it's more equitable and just.
There was maybe a second slide, if you wanted to show it now, or is that for later? Okay, great. Due to time constraint, I'll move on to the next question. Thank you very much, Hanbit. The second question that I would like to ask, especially to Jean-Baptiste, is how has China's digital Silk Road impacted smart city development in different regions, such as Asia, of course, but also Africa and even Europe and beyond?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm not from Geneva. I'm not from Zurich, so I'm always glad to be back here in Zurich with this community of Asia Society. So I'm really glad to be here today, and thank you for inviting me for this panel discussion. So regarding your question, the concept of digital Silk Road has emerged recently, trying to highlight the fact that China is, exporting its technology, like it's the technology arm of the of the Belt and Road Initiative. We can see that in Africa, for example. In a couple of examples, we see Chinese giants, and this is what my final project was about. Chinese giants like ZTE or Huawei, not only in the case of Huawei selling phones, but also driving, filling the internet divide, and going into some project like public camera surveillance in, for example, Uganda. And in Burkina Faso, for example, in Ouagadougou, there was a terrorist attack in the HQ of the army. So in that context, you see that there was a need to, have more vision of what's going around, and, Huawei helped to do that as well in Uganda in terms of urban criminality. So this is very helpful. But coming back to what Francis was saying, I understand that you speak from a law background, but sometimes it also depends on where you are, the context, and also the stage. I will say that in terms of context, it's obvious that in Europe, people are more, cautious about the privacy when accessing a website or in general. In China, it can be different because, of course, we value the public interest instead of the individual. And for example, if I know many of us have been in China, and when you enter, you feel like in a bubble. You have to use WeChat, at least if you're staying for a couple of weeks or years. You have to use WeChat. You have to use Zhifubao, the Alipay for payment. You have to use specific apps that, the city and the activities and everything is, the configuration is in a way that it's how it functions. You can choose to not to not do it, but I guess you will have a hard time living there. So I think the Chinese context, when I was in China, I did my bachelor's in Beijing. I was, when asking me, you should accept this, I was a bit not willing to do that, but at the end I said, okay, let's just do it, because anyway, it's how it is in the context also matters a lot when it comes to, so in some contexts, like the European context, may be cautious, in China less. And in the example that I just gave in Ouagadougou, that people will obviously say that, yes, maybe there are some issues in privacy, security of data, but the fact that there's a vital danger, like terrorists attacking the country, people will be willing to give up on these rights of, the surveillance and everything that's going on. And if I have, I don't know if I have a couple of minutes, and we can see that also in terms of regulations. In the ILO, for example, I know that there's also a fellow here who works for the WTO. It's difficult to really put some conventions, and especially in the ILO, on these things, because those states from the south feel that they're taking benefit of this, and they do not, mostly when there are discussions, it's not only about the employers or the big companies that are against, regulations, putting regulations on technologies or, smart things. But also the governments from those countries are not really enthusiastic about that, because obviously it goes with lots of advantages. It creates jobs where the public authority couldn't, provide. So they are, in general, enthusiastic about that. And I just wanted to say, okay, maybe it depends on the context, and in somehow, it can be different depending on where we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the key takeaway we have is that it usually does have a positive impact, no matter like how some parties are not always happy with that, but in general, overall, it has it's showing positivity. For the next question, I would like to ask you all, what about cross-collaboration? So with various models emerging in the smart city sector, is there room for collaboration? Or is the world heading toward competing models? And maybe just like, I actually didn't really introduce the different smart cities here that are pictured on the slide. So on the top left, this is Songdo in Korea. On the top right is, I think, Shenzhen in China. On the bottom left, it's in Rwanda. I can't remember the city, I apologize. And on the bottom right, it's Singapore. I think you can recognize. But this was, I think it was kind of interesting to have a bit of a illustration. Yes, so maybe who would like to start?
Yeah, I can start. With these cities, just looking at the image, we can kind of see that there's many similarities in the big cities. I think as a globe, we're converging towards similar forms of cities, although, of course, there's cultural and social differences in every city and different governance structures, which would require different approaches. But I think many of the challenges that the large global cities are facing are very similar, which means that there's a lot of opportunities for cross-city learning. And if you can move on to the next slide. And in addressing these sort of issues, one of the helpful things to have is a good metric to see how different cities compare in meeting important goals that cities have. And I would say like these 5 goals that which Global Cities Index, which is a big research project that looks and evaluates different cities in terms of these 5 criteria: economics, human capital, quality of life, environment, and governance. And these 5 components and how they balance each other out kind of provides a good framework to thinking how we should see cities beyond just like economic growth and GDP, but also other important social capital and equity and justice as well. So I think considering these kind of more holistic framework to view different models of development and how we evaluate different smart cities can be a very helpful way of looking at how cities can learn from each other.
Francis, maybe would you have something to add to that?
I think when I'm thinking about the different smart city models, I think there's probably various levels to look at what a smart city model exactly is. And I guess the obvious choice would be to look at the implemented smart city solutions. However, I think there it is very hard to, I guess there is a Chinese model which is being exported also to Africa, to Afghanistan, which is very much centered around this security and safety aspect. However, in terms of at least the Western project, if you look at what is funded by the EU, etc., it is very often still kind of like a prototype projects, small projects, maybe 2 buildings, etc. When it's hard to say, like, 2 modern buildings, that's very nice, but it's hard to say that this is a model for a city. And so I think like maybe at this time it's more interesting to go one level below and think about these kind of like different approaches to data governance and which are implemented in society and then of course affect smart cities. And as I already said, like I guess in China there is the idea of data governance or data sovereignty is very much around state sovereignty over data. There are rules about export of, for example, scientific data or so-called important data. There are, of course, there's the data protection rules, which are very limited. And of course, there, I mean, that kind of works with the smart city ideas. In Europe, I guess the question of data governance is currently undergoing huge changes, which I don't know if you're aware of. There's a EU data strategy, which is trying to break down data silos to basically, for example, enforce IoT providers to share the data with the users and even transfer data to competitors and various policies being implemented. And that, I think, if it works, it will be very good for smart cities. However, it is a huge experiment affecting actually almost all legal and institutional levels of the EU. And I think it remains to be seen whether it works. I mean, my biggest concern is that for investors in these kind of IoT solutions, of course, a big reason why they invest into these solutions is to basically create a digital platform which then binds the customer closer to a certain company and then ensures that basically other products and other services will be sold to that same customer. If you break up this kind of silo, it's questionable how attractive or investable European IoT will be for at least investors which have other alternatives. In the US, of course, as I said, there's no real coherent data governance. There are individual rules for military contractors, etc. And these different models, I think, make it much more difficult to actually collaborate on the city level because, well, as I said, for example, China for a very long time, they've restricted the data exports. Nowadays, also, for example, the new EU Data Act has rules which says if a foreign government requests data from a private company, then it needs to review whether this can actually be done. And it's quite clearly a measure against the Chinese way of data governance. So I think this divergence of data governance ways is kind of creating a problem for this collaboration on an international or inter-system way. Of course, collaboration within the EU will become much easier through this, but on the international level, it's probably more difficult.
Thank you very much for this fascinating look, all of you. We really see that smart cities are not just technical, but deeply human, political, and global. We could go on and on, to be honest. I would like to hear more from all of your perspectives, but yes, we're running out of time. Maybe before we move on to the Q&A, so that we can get everyone involved, I would like to ask one last question where you could intervene, maybe with a short answer, whatever comes up to your mind. So the question would be, what is one priority that policymakers or business leaders must focus on to ensure smart cities can benefit everyone?
I don't have an answer to that. Maybe we should rethink the concept of smart in smart cities. Smart, does it mean sophisticated technology or just something that you can, just think about it and solve a problem? For example, if the city of Zurich decides to create, smart bins that will, for example, remind you didn't put the bottle in the right box. Maybe some people will be okay with that, but I wouldn't like to be reminded, you know, by an intelligence that, yeah, you should do this. But instead of doing that, we can just find something smart, maybe just educating people to, you know, to how to manage the trash and things like that. So maybe this is not a business idea, but for me, maybe rethinking the concept of smart as something just simple, or just reuniting communities, the environment, creating a great environment for people to just meet each other and think about solutions to their problems, instead of, you know, just very sophisticated things that in the end will create other problems and going endless. Yeah. But I'm sure that Francis has a great idea for business. You go first.
I think for me, when we think of smart cities, I think often we think of like business districts and only focus on like private sector solution. But I think smart city and good use of data and optimization also has a lot to offer in public sector as well, especially in terms of public infrastructure. For example, like transport systems and energy infrastructures, how we can use data to make these public systems more optimal and cost efficient and beneficial for everyone. I think for me personally, I love many things about Switzerland, nature and people, but I think the train system is one of the greatest things that Switzerland has. And I think using data to optimize these systems and expanding these kind of public network that benefits and improves quality of life of people and make it accessible, I think that's a really important thing that many cities could follow the example of.
I think I also struggle with like having a one precise policy priority, but I guess on the European level, and I guess that will also affect, on the EU level, and that will also affect Switzerland afterwards. I think it's a great idea to regulate or like to find rules on how to deal with data in the business world, because data has become like a key resource for not just business but in society in general. But I think like it will just require many revisions and many adjustments to find a kind of solution which works out well. And what I'm seeing, the tendency in the EU is like basically to correct the regulation with more regulation and adding more rules and hoping that something will work out. But maybe if the outcome of the current regulation is that it's too much, then probably there will be that should also be the regulator should be open to that idea, I guess.
Well, thank you to all of you. This marks the end of our panel today.